No one would bother giving a place like this a name. A hard cut in the landscape, a wide valley, without trees, without shade, without birds crossing the sky. The light falls straight onto the ground, and nothing answers back with the color of green. The earth is split with cracks, as if rain had ignored it for years. The wind passes through, dragging dust that rises and then quickly dissolves. Nothing grows, nothing moves. Then they appear, the remains of what once were bodies, bones scattered across an area too vast for the eye to take in all at once, human fragments torn apart, thrown across the ground like pieces of a story taken apart, skulls lying on their sides, some turned upward toward the sky, others halfway swallowed by the hardened soil. Nothing is whole, nothing is arranged. It is the trace of a multitude that once existed and has been reduced to anonymous remains. There is no mass grave, no tombs, no headstones with names, dates, or epitaphs. If someone came looking for signs of a recent battle, they would find none. No broken weapons, no discarded shield, no burned tent. The valley does not show the marks of a sudden clash, but of an old, distant end that finally emptied itself out here. The bones are very dry, porous, rough, marked by years of exposure to sun and drought. Time has passed over this place again and again. The morning is over, the memory has faded. What remains is this open desolation of bones laid bare. There is no visible distinction among the remains, no way to tell who was important and who was overlooked, who led and who followed. Everything ended leveled on the same ground. There is no reserved section, no privilege preserved in death. It is a field where no one is recognized. The questions rise almost on their own. Who were they? How did they end up here? What kind of story was forced to end like this, scattered and unrecorded? The valley gives no answers. The scene leaves the impression that this is not just the wear and tear of time. It is the closing of something that kept drifting away from life until nothingness was the only end left. And into this scene, a figure appears suddenly. He does not walk in slowly from a distance. He is brought there. From one moment to the next, he is standing in the middle of the valley, in territory ruled by extinction. His feet touch the dry ground. Dust rises and settles along the edges of the exposed bones. With every step, more fragments come into view. He is not there as a wanderer who lost his way, not a traveler drawn here by chance. He is there because he has been summoned. He receives no explanation, no summary of what happened. What he sees is not the beginning of the tragedy, but its result, a valley filled with very dry bones. After every cry, every pain, and every drop of blood have already been spent, what is left is a sepulchral stillness. He moves among the bones. Each step opens a path through loose ribs, fragments of spine, and fallen skulls, some on the surface, others half buried, all scattered. The layout of the scene suggests a story shattered beyond what the mind can piece back together, a living man set down in the middle of death. A voice breaks the morbid silence. It does not come from the wind, does not echo from the rocks, does not rise from the bones. It is the voice of the one who brought him there, and his question comes without any softening. Son of man, can these bones live? The sentence cuts across the valley. It does not simply ask whether a body can be put back together. It presses whether a story taken to the very height of destruction can be reversed. Can those who have been completely undone ever live again? Is there any way back from here? He hears the question while standing inside that funeral atmosphere. The bones remain motionless, the ground stays scarred, the wind keeps blowing harsh and dry. Everything around him shouts no with force, while the voice of God compels him to think about something impossible. The answer, however, does not come, because to grasp the weight of that question, it is not enough to look at the valley. You have to know whom these bones stand for, what people once carried a story of covenant, favor, and promise, only to end up like this. The valley shows the end. The real investigation starts earlier. Before all of this, there was a city, a temple, a covenant, promises and warnings. There were feasts, songs, and altars. There was a people who felt far too secure in their own confidence. To understand what happened, we have to return to the time when these bones still had life and story, to the moment when no one could have imagined that one day everything would end here. Long before bones lay scattered across a devastated valley, The streets were full and alive, with songs rising and the incense of sacrifices curling up toward heaven. There was a city that, in the eyes of its own people, symbolized the very heart of the world, Jerusalem. After the northern kingdom fell and Samaria was taken, Judah still stood, smaller on the map, yet carrying something no other nation possessed, the temple. As reports of destroyed cities spread, many in Jerusalem looked at the walls and the Temple Mount with the quiet confidence that they were safe there. The city lived between the noise of the markets and the constant sight of the sanctuary above, merchants calling for customers, children running and playing, hammers striking wood and metal. Over all of it, the silhouette of the temple dominating the top of the hill. Simply living there was a daily reminder that these people had an official house built for the God of Israel. During the feasts, the roads filled up, families made their way up with dusty cloaks, animals led by ropes, baskets full of offerings. From a distance, they could see the walls, the gates, the towers and, above everything else, the temple. As they drew closer, the songs grew louder. There, the past was retold, in the Psalms, in the reading of the law, in the prayers. The people remembered Egypt, Pharaoh brought down, the blood on the doorposts, the sea parting, the desert crossed, the promised land reached. God was not a distant idea, but the one who dwelt in their midst. Then came the kings. David, the shepherd who brought down giants and took Jerusalem to make it the royal city. He brought the ark, danced before it, and treated that place as the center of the presence of the Most High. After him, Solomon built the temple in splendor. The dedication of that building was remembered as the day when the glory filled the house of the Lord. These stories did not live only in scrolls stored away. They were repeated in songs, in conversations, in the instructions of parents to children. Feasts marked the calendar, pilgrimages filled the land, sacrifices were offered daily. Priests, Levites, the altar, incense, everything pointed to the reality that this people lived inside a special covenant. Over time, however, their confidence was twisted. The temple, which was meant to be a sign of grace, began to be treated like a guarantee, as if simply having it were enough to be safe. A false certainty took root. If the temple is here, God is with us. If God is with us, nothing truly destructive can reach us. The disaster of the northern kingdom came to be viewed as something that happens only to other people. Judah saw itself as the resilient core, the center of true faith. Prophets called them to repentance, exposed injustice and idolatry, but their voices were drowned in the noise of a religion pleased with itself. They knew about the Exodus, but treated deliverance as an automatic shield. They knew about David, but hid behind the promise made to his house without examining their own hearts. They knew about Solomon's temple and the glory that had filled it, but ignored the fact that the same God who entered could also depart. While life went on in Jerusalem, few even considered the possibility of total collapse. Crowded streets, priests serving, sacrifices burning on the altar, everything gave the impression of guaranteed continuity. The drifting away from God was disguised beneath the sound of psalms and the smell of incense. That is why the contrast with the Valley of Bones is so brutal. The people now represented by dry remains in a desolate place were not ignorant. They were the people who had lived through the most astonishing stories, received the clearest signs, and heard the most direct promises. They had the temple, the chosen city, the royal line, and so an uncomfortable question forces its way in. How did this people end up like that? If the mercies of the Lord never fail, and even so everything they had been given did not keep them from ending in a barren valley, then a long process of moral and spiritual decay must have taken place long before the walls fell. The man who now stood among a multitude of dry bones had once walked among exiles who still remembered Jerusalem in vivid detail. He had heard memories, laments, excuses. Now, to understand that valley, he has to look at two extremes: the people who had everything before God, and the point at which almost nothing was left. Between one and the other, there is a breaking line that still needs to be exposed, and this is where the prophet Ezekiel comes in, not as someone who watched from a distance, but as a priest torn away from the world of the temple and set down by foreign rivers, carrying a calling that no longer had a place to stand. When Jerusalem moved from the threat of ruin to desolation itself, the story was carried off to another land, not on the shoulders of the conquerors, but in the weary steps of the defeated. Babylon rose before the exiles like another world: high walls, heavy gates, wide streets, hanging gardens, statues guarding the entrances of temples. In place of the hills of Judah, plains cut through by rivers and canals, the waters of the Kebar flowed steadily, serving both labor and the brief pauses when the exiles sat down to remember what had been left behind. There, along the banks of those canals, Judah was scattered in settlements. There was no more going up to the temple on feast days, only long walks to hard work for the empire. The language around them was different, the customs, different. The gods carved into walls and columns bore names they were forced to learn to pronounce. At night, by the river, memories came back. Some described the streets of Jerusalem, the temple courts, the smell of incense, the sound of psalms. Others spoke of friends killed, relatives lost in the siege, houses invaded, fire consuming what had once been considered proof of God's care. With every story, Babylon sank in deeper as the only reality left, living evidence that their old sense of safety had collapsed. Among the exiles, one carried a different kind of calling. Ezekiel was from the priestly line. His future had been mapped out around the temple. From early on he had learned about garments, rituals, sacrifices, purity. His very identity revolved around a place that was now far away, burned, desecrated. Instead of marble courts, a riverbank; instead of an altar, a foreign horizon; instead of the Levites' choir, the songs of pagan priests. The calling remained, but suspended. With no altar on which to be fulfilled, he walked among the displaced, feeling the mixture of longing, anger, and confusion. He carried the memory of what Jerusalem had meant, and, at the same time, saw around him temples dedicated to other gods, filled with symbols utterly at odds with Israel's covenant. The people responded to exile in different ways. Some were sure it would all be over quickly. The fall of Jerusalem could not be final. "We'll be back soon," they said in many forms, as if the burned-out temple still held some invisible guarantee. The idea of a long captivity was unthinkable. Others collapsed in the opposite direction. For them, exile was proof of abandonment. The distance from Jerusalem felt like the distance from God. Prayer seemed useless. Remembering the old feasts only deepened the emptiness. There were also those who downplayed their guilt. They did not see their sins as serious enough to justify what they were living through. The siege, the hunger, the destruction seemed like punishments far out of proportion. If judgment made no sense, the heart found it hard to be broken. Ezekiel lived in the middle of these interpretations. The same people who had once gone up to the temple now tried to explain their banishment in whatever way they could. For some, it was enough to wait out a rough season. For others, all that remained was to survive in a world where the promises seemed to have failed. God seemed silent. There was no priesthood functioning in Jerusalem. No altar burning, no glory filling the house. There were memories and questions. For Ezekiel, that silence took on another shape. He was a priest without a temple, a man with a calling and no place to serve. Between his vocation and his reality, there was a chasm, and in that chasm, something had begun to move, waiting for the exact moment to break the stillness, and it would begin by reaching this displaced man, seated by a canal in the land of Babylon. It was by the water's edge that the calm finally broke. The scene was the same as always: water flowing, people coming and going, exiles trying to carve out some kind of life in a foreign land. Nothing suggested that day would be any different, until another reality began to press in, first as an inner force, then as an irresistible vision. Ezekiel lifts his eyes. He looks toward the north, from where the invading armies had once come. From there, something approaches, a great cloud, surrounded by brilliance, sliced through with flashes of lightning. Inside it, fire burns relentlessly, like metal glowing in a furnace. But this is no ordinary storm. Strangely, there is order in the middle of the fire. Something is taking shape. As he looks more closely, Ezekiel sees 4 living creatures. They look something like men, and yet each one has 4 faces and 4 wings. Their straight legs stand on feet as firm as those of a calf, gleaming like polished bronze. Their wings touch one another, forming a single moving unit, and they move straight ahead without being distracted. Beside each one is a shining wheel, not set in a simple arrangement, but positioned like intersecting wheels. able to move in any direction, and all around them are eyes, many eyes. No corner escapes their gaze. The creatures move forward without turning aside. The wheels move with them, driven by the same spirit. Wherever the spirit goes, they go, all of them together, like one living organism. Above them, something like a vault stretches out, radiant, dividing what is below from what is above. When the creatures fly, the sound of their wings is like the roar of seas, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army in battle. When they stop, their wings fold, and the noise falls silent. Above the vault appears a throne unlike any other, like sapphire, exalted and lifted high, and on the throne, someone who looks very much like a man, yet from what appears to be his waist up, he looks like glowing metal, full of fire. From his waist down, the same blazing radiance mingled with flames. The glow around him shines like a rainbow in the clouds on a day of rain. Ezekiel knows the stories of the glory filling the temple. Now he witnesses that glory in motion, coming toward the exile along the same route by which judgment once arrived. The God who allowed his people to fall was not trapped in their ruins. He was coming, fully aware of every smallest detail. The eyes and the wheels make this unmistakably clear. No idolatry, no injustice, no lie in Jerusalem is truly hidden. What the elders do in secret, what leaders defend with religious pretense, what the people carry out while hiding behind the excuse of not understanding, all of it stands recorded before his throne. Ezekiel throws himself face down on the ground as he realizes he is seeing the glory of the Lord. He understands that his God is not absent in the face of tragedy. He knows exactly why his people are where they are. Then, a voice speaks to him. "Son of man, stand up on your feet and I will speak to you." The Spirit enters Ezekiel and sets him on his feet. He is no longer just a spectator. Right in front of him, a scroll appears, written on both sides, filled with lament and mourning and woe. It is not a collection of easy promises. It is the record of what the people refuse to see. The next command is strange, yet unmistakable: eat the scroll. The prophet obeys. The word of judgment does not remain outside of him. It goes in, becomes part of who he is. In his mouth, it is sweet as honey because it is true. The bitterness will come when he has to proclaim it to a people who do not want to listen. There, Ezekiel ceases to be merely a displaced priest. He becomes a witness entrusted with telling what God sees. His actions, his words and his visions begin to form God's own indictment against Judah. The task is hard. He will not be sent to foreigners with obscure speech and difficult language, but to his own people, familiar with the language of faith, yet hard of heart. His mission is not to measure the outcome, but to deliver the message of God. This is made plain in the sentence, whether they listen or fail to listen. By a foreign river, with Jerusalem in ruins, God interrupts the exile with his very presence. Silence gives way to glory in motion, and a priest without an altar receives a new calling, to explain, with his own life, how a people who had everything came so close to death, and what God still intends to do with them. To understand why a people end up like a valley of bones, it is not enough to look at the captivity. We have to go back to the place everyone considered the safest of all, the temple. Still in Babylon, the hand of God takes hold of Ezekiel again. In a vision, he is carried back to Jerusalem, not to the ordinary streets, but inside the very complex of the sanctuary. He does not enter as a pilgrim on a feast day, but as an observer being led through doors almost no one knows. From the outside, everything looks normal: courtyards, columns, smoke rising from the altar, priests on duty, people going in and out. To anyone looking only at appearances, worship is still going on. Ezekiel, however, is guided past the surface. Behind discreet doors are chambers that never come up in casual conversations. When he enters, he sees walls covered with carvings, animals, repulsive creatures, figures from foreign cults, all of it inside the space that was meant to belong only to the one living God. Among these images stand the elders of Israel, men with reputation, familiar names. They burn incense before the idols and say, in their hearts, that the Lord does not see them. The vision shifts. Near the entrance of the temple, women are weeping for Tammuz, a Mesopotamian fertility god, often seen as the darling of women. They mourn a foreign deity in the courtyard of the house dedicated to the God of Israel. Farther in, between the portico and the altar, priests turned toward the east, their backs to the most holy place, to worship the rising sun. The very men who should be blessing the people in the name of the Lord now bow down before a created star. In a short time, it becomes clear to Ezekiel, the problem started here. The center of worship was the first place to be contaminated. The temple, meant to be the set-apart dwelling of God's presence, had become a stage for carefully concealed betrayals. On the outside, sacrifices and songs. On the inside, walls covered with idols, tears shed for other gods, backs turned to the holiest place of all. In the middle of this vision, something decisive happens. The glory of the God of Israel moves. It rises from the place it once occupied, above the cherubim in the most holy place, and goes to the entrance of the temple. This is not a simple shift in position. The one who had promised to dwell there stands up. He does not vanish all at once. He pauses at the threshold, like someone who stands at the door before leaving a house that has become unrecognizable. Ezekiel watches as one who now sees the true root of the ruin. The beginning of the collapse was not in exile in Babylon, but in the moment the temple itself was taken over by the worship of other gods. After those visions, the prophet never looked at the exile the same way again. The river, the makeshift houses, the tired faces, everything was the result of what he had seen: a corrupted temple, glory on the move, a city on the brink of collapse. But God had not called him just to witness the cause of the damage. He called him to warn where the consequences were heading. The Lord then set before him the image of a watchman on the walls, a man in a tower, scanning the distance. Ezekiel understood the message well. He was no longer just a deportee, no longer only a priest without a temple. He was now a watchman for the house of Israel. His role was to deliver God's message to his own people, warning them of their iniquities and pleading with them to repent. If he did this, he would be free of guilt, even if no one listened. If he kept silent, he would become an accomplice in his brother's fall and share in the same blood guilt. Yet, in the midst of this hard reality, and even as the people admitted that their sins were many, and that because of them, they were losing heart and giving up hope, God still poured out his immense mercy in one of the clearest declarations of his loving character. "As surely as I live," declares the sovereign Lord, "I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live." The warnings, however, did not stop there. God began to command actions that, in the eyes of others, looked extreme. In truth, they were the people's own story being reenacted in the prophet's body. Ezekiel was ordered to lie on one side for 390 days, representing the years of Israel's guilt, and then 40 days on the other side for the years of Judah. Each day, the Lord himself said, would stand for a year. The ground became a timeline, his body, a map of rebellion. Day after day, he stayed in that position, declaring without words that the guilt was not recent. It was an old heap of sin that had been carried forward and piled higher and higher. More signs followed: measured bread, counted grain, rationed water, impure fire. He ate what God commanded, foreshadowing what Jerusalem would soon face: scarcity, defilement, humiliation. The table, which should have been a place of provision and joy, became a sign of shame. The next command, to shave his head and beard and divide the hair into 3 parts, was not random. These acts were linked to moments of mourning, a visible expression of devastating grief. 1/3 of the hair was to be burned inside the city, another third was to be struck with the sword and scattered around it. The final third was to be thrown to the wind, with only a few strands tucked into the folds of his garment. From those remaining strands, a small portion would be cast into the fire, and from that fire flames would spread. The exiles watched all this unfold. Some dismissed it as excess. A man lying on his side for months, unclean bread, hair burned and tossed into the air. It looked like madness, drama with no meaning. Others felt a deep unease but pushed it aside. It was easier to call it exaggeration than to admit that God was clearly revealing the extent of his judgment. Even so, as they saw the prophet motionless day after day, they remembered the years in which they had refused correction. When they heard about rationing and scarcity, they pictured walls surrounded by enemies. As they watched the hair being burned and scattered, they sensed a terrible announcement hidden in that sign. Every gesture pointed to the imminent destruction of Jerusalem. For Ezekiel, the weight of that calling was heavy and constant. Each act that seemed strange to others was part of a solemn pact of responsibility before God. If he did not warn them, their blood would be required at his hand. In the end, one thing was permanently settled. The people would never be able to say they had not been warned. When the siege came, when the temple went up in flames, when the city fell, it would not be bad luck or murky politics, it would be a sentence carried out. Ezekiel, like the watchman, had done what was his to do. History would not move forward without warning. The glory that rises from within the temple does not remain standing at the entrance, it moves through the city. In Ezekiel's vision, the presence of God leaves the most holy place, passes through the temple doorway, and moves over Jerusalem. Streets that once received processions and songs are now crossed in silence by the one who once filled them with light. The glory reaches the edge of the city and stops over the Mount of Olives. From there, everything can be seen: walls, houses, palaces, courtyards. It is a final look, not from someone defeated, but from the one who knows exactly why the city has come to this point. Meanwhile, in the flow of history, the siege tightens. The armies of Babylon encircle Jerusalem like a ring. Water and food are cut off. What used to be routine becomes a memory. Hunger storms into the houses, fierce and merciless, driving people to despair. Disease spreads through narrow, filthy streets. Inside the city, some still repeat in their own way, God will not let the temple fall. But the days pass, the enemies do not withdraw, supplies vanish. When the walls finally break, everything that was held back spills out. Soldiers flood in, doors are smashed, houses plundered. Fear runs faster than the warrior's footsteps. Those who try to flee are chased down. Those who remain watch everything around them collapse. The temple is not spared. The place that for centuries had been the visible sign of the presence of the living God is violated by pagan, foreign hands. Treasures are carried off, consecrated vessels turned into trophies. Soon after, the fire comes, beams, doors, curtains, everything yields to the flames. To those watching from inside, it looks like the end of God's story with Israel. To the one who sees from the vantage point of his glory, it is something else. The God who rose up from the temple is not being defeated. He is leaving the place where many insisted on rejecting him. Later, messengers arrive among the exiles, exhausted, scarred by their escape, with a look that tells of catastrophe before their mouths can form the words. The news comes raw: Jerusalem has fallen, the temple has been burned, the city has been torn down. Among the captives, the shock runs deep. It is not just the capital that has been lost. The faith of a nation seems to crumble with it. If the temple has fallen, some think, then either God is lost, or he has given up. Promises, psalms, ancient stories feel as if they have been swallowed by the same fire that consumed the city. Ezekiel hears the report differently. He feels the pain, he feels the shock, but he is not surprised. He had already seen the glory rise up. He had already seen the inside of the temple taken over by other gods. He had already acted out with his own body the hunger, the sword, the scattering. The fall of Jerusalem brings into daylight what God had already shown in visions. Judgment is not a sudden explosion of anger or merely Babylonian strength. It is the end point of a long chain of refusals, idolatry, injustice, and self-deception. Many ask, has God abandoned us? The truth is another. The people abandoned God long before. The city falls, the temple burns, the glory departs. It is not just a physical structure that collapses. A false security comes crashing down. The nation, as it knew itself, dies there. It continues to exist, but without its old supports, without its invincible image, without the pride of having the temple while refusing to serve the God who made his name dwell there. In the prophet's mind, the condensed image of this moment returns: the Valley of Bones, a story driven all the way to the point where, to human eyes, nothing can be rebuilt. The crime is complete. What began with unfaithfulness at the center of worship ends with a devastated city and a scattered people. The sentence has been carried out, but in the unfathomable mind of the Lord, the case is not closed yet. In Babylon, the years start to stack up. Brick houses rise along the canals, gardens are planted, children run through streets that have never heard the songs of Jerusalem. Work for the empire fills the days. At night, by the riverbank, the stories return of the city that burned, the temple that collapsed, the king led away in chains. A repeated sigh sums up what many are thinking: we will never be what we once were. There is no city to go back to, the temple is a distant heap of ashes. David's throne stands empty, the culture around them fills every inch of space it can. Language, customs, gods, symbols, their hands still bake bread, plant crops, raise children. But inside, there is a hollow feeling, as if Israel's story had been cut off, and all that remains is to hang on until they slowly disappear, absorbed among the nations. In this setting of life after death, the hand of the Lord reaches for Ezekiel once more. The sound of the Kabar fades, the voices disappear, the prophet is pulled away from the riverbank, and the vision opens again. The valley is there, the same hard, cracked ground, the same absence of green, the same sea of very dry bones, but there is a difference in the prophet's gaze. Between the first vision and this one, he has seen the inside of the temple covered with idols, the glory rising up, the siege announced, the fall confirmed. Now, every bone seems to carry a piece of those scenes. These are not just human remains, they are the condition of the nation laid bare, a people without city, without king, without altar. Once again, the Lord places him in the middle, no high lookout, no safe distance, dry ground under his feet, bones in every direction. The voice calls him as before, and the same question is raised, word for word. Son of man, can these bones live? After seeing Jerusalem in flames, the temple brought down, and hearing the harrowing reports of survivors, the question sounds almost absurd. The bones have no flesh, no tendons, no trace of recent death or lingering life. Everything around him says the same thing: it's over. Inside Ezekiel, two certainties collide. He knows the scale of the ruin, he knows who is asking, he has seen sin exposed in the temple and knows the judgment was not unjust. He has felt in his own body the weight of years of unfaithfulness. He has heard from the mouth of the Most High that the sword would come. At the same time, he knows the God who split the sea, sustained his people in the wilderness, called Abraham, and promised a throne to David. Standing in that valley, he does not risk an opinion. He does not declare life. He does not seal death. He simply hands the verdict back to the only one who can give it. Sovereign Lord, you alone know. In that moment, the sentence carries a double confession. It acknowledges that, for any human being, the case is lost. No strategy, no effort, no power within Israel or beyond it can turn that field of bones into a restored people, a renewed nation, and at the same time, it declares that the Creator is not bound by what the evidence suggests. If there is a future, it will come from Him. It will be the grace of a compassionate God, not the achievement of a deserving people. The valley stays silent, the ground does not tremble, the bones do not rearrange themselves. Ezekiel has gone as far as a man can go in what he can say. From this point on, whatever happens there will not come from a nation trying to pull itself back together. It will come from the word of the Lord spoken over a people who already considered themselves dead. The valley remains unchanged after his last answer. Bones everywhere, ground parched and hostile, no visible change. Suddenly, the voice of the Lord speaks again. This time, the command is not to see, it is to act. Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Ezekiel obeys. In the middle of that field of ancient remains, his voice rises over what, to human eyes, cannot hear and cannot respond. He announces that God will put tendons on them, flesh on them, skin over them, and will give them life. A lone man standing, surrounded by scattered bones, speaking to what does not react. As soon as the prophecy ends, the valley is no longer still. A faint sound is heard, like a distant tremor, then a growing rattle, dry and sharp, of rigid structures knocking against one another. Bones begin to move. From every direction, fragments drag themselves over the ground, slide, collide, and connect. What was once scattered starts to seek its proper place. Right before the prophet's eyes, forms are rebuilt, all the loose parts reassemble into complete skeletons. Tendons appear over them, fastening each joint. Then, layers of flesh emerge, filling what was empty. Finally, skin covers everything, fully enclosing every once exposed layer. In a short time, the valley changes from a sea of bones into a field filled with outstretched bodies. The scene is different now. The open-air graveyard has become a vast plain covered with full human forms, but something essential is still missing. Ezekiel looks closer and realizes there is no life. Entire bodies, motionless, no breathing, no movement, like statues freshly carved, perfect on the outside, empty within. The Word of God has already gathered what was scattered, already reassembled what was broken, yet there is no breath. Without it, the valley remains, in another form but just as truly, under the rule of death. The Lord speaks again. Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, Son of man, and say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. Now the prophet addresses the breath. He calls to it from the four corners of the earth, summoning it to enter the lifeless bodies. His voice, in the middle of the valley, sounds as if he were mustering an invisible army. The wind blows. It is no ordinary breeze, but a movement aimed at a single purpose, sweeping the valley from end to end. The breath enters the bodies lying there, filling the emptiness inside. Chests rise for the first time, air moves in and out. One by one, the corpses begin to stand, hands press against the ground, knees steady themselves, feet bear the weight as bodies rise. The landscape no longer resembles the first vision. The valley that was once a field of death is now crowded with a vast number of people on their feet, aligned, steady. They are not flickering shadows, they are an army. Then the Lord explains this miraculous reversal of the end to Ezekiel. Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They are not nameless dead, not a random mix of nations. This is the portrait of the people themselves. The outcasts had been saying that their bones were dried up, that their hope was gone, that they were cut off. Those murmurs by the riverbank now stand embodied before the prophet. Every person on their feet there represents a hope that had already been buried. God still has more to say. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. It is not a promise of slightly easier days in Babylon. It is a direct contradiction of death's logic, opening graves, bringing out what has been buried, leading them back to the land that seemed lost forever. And he goes on, highlighting the core of the transformation. I will put my spirit in you and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. This declaration reveals something deep. The people will not simply be put back where they were, unchanged, ready to repeat the same sins that condemned them. They will receive the Spirit of God as the very principle of life, as the active agent of renewal. Their survival will no longer depend on walls and buildings. Finally, his closing note, then you will know that I the Lord have spoken, and I have done it. The valley becomes undeniable evidence. At the beginning, nameless, storyless bones cover the cracked ground, then, restored and complete bodies lie there, yet still. At last, a living army fills the plain once ruled by death. Surrounded by this newly raised multitude, Ezekiel understands. The question, can these bones live, was not an empty provocation. It was the doorway into a new chapter. The same God who pronounced judgment on his people's unfaithfulness now speaks life over them out of sheer love. The valley that once seemed to be the final image of the end becomes the unlikely stage of a collective resurrection, foreshadowing a greater, ultimate restoration still to come. From the temple in flames to the valley filled with people standing on their feet, the whole path leads to the same question. Who killed Israel? The Babylonians wielded the sword, but they were not the first to pierce the heart of the people. Long before the siege tightened, the high places were already rotting from within, in hidden chambers of the temple, in the blending of the Lord's name with idols, in the decisions of leaders who traded justice for advantage, in the indifference toward the weak. The covenant was being abandoned piece by piece. Idolatry did not begin in the public square, but when the people trusted more in the safety of the temple than in the God who made it holy, when the covenant became a shield, not a commitment, when the law was used as religious rhetoric, not as a path to be walked. The spiritual crime was born in the place of greatest privilege, the center of worship. That is why, when Jerusalem fell, it was not because God lost to Babylon. He rose up from the temple, withdrew his glory and protection, and handed the city over. Judgment was no accident. It was an answer, severe, foretold, acted out in the prophet's own body, and ignored again and again. Yet even in the face of such stubbornness, the Lord did not close the file. The same God who watched his temple being claimed by other gods was the one who descended into the valley of dry bones. The same hand that was raised against the city was raised over the dead. The judge who confirmed the fall was the same one who ordered the reassembling of what no longer had shape or hope. Restoration did not rise from a people trying to pull themselves together. It began with God. The valley that seemed to prove the end became the center of a grace that, though it does not cancel judgment, refuses to abandon us inside it. Across the centuries, the form of the revelation changes, but the effects remain the same, and without forcing parallels, it is hard not to see the pattern. A community can speak fluent faith and dry up on the inside. A life can go on with work, obligations, routines, and still reach a point where, in the part no one sees, only scattered fragments remain. There are valleys that never show up on any map, and bones that never appear in visions. There are faiths that were once vibrant and are now only memories of old experiences. There are clear callings that have been abandoned until they turned into distant stories. There are marriages that began with a covenant before God and have now become a devastated coexistence. There are churches that still hold services, sing hymns, preach sermons, but have lost their breath and are dragging themselves forward purely out of habit. Often it does not take a prophet to point out these sicknesses of the soul. We may not know the exact moment of the collapse, but we can see the state of things now. The gap between what God has already done and continues to do, and the way we actually live, can feel as wide as the distance between Jerusalem and celebration and the valley of very dry bones. It is at that point that the old question draws near again: can these bones live? That is not a question for quick, packaged answers. Whoever knows their own story knows why they traded covenant with the Most High for other securities, why they smothered the voice of God, why they made repeated choices that cracked the ground until everything buried underneath was exposed. Saying you just have to start over is too little. It does not reach that depth. Ezekiel's answer is still the most honest one. Sovereign Lord, you alone know. It does not downplay the damage. It admits there is no strength in us capable of gathering bones, forming muscles, creating breath. It leaves the initiative, the way, and the timing in the Creator's hands. The God of Ezekiel is still the God who brings stories to an end when he must, and who restarts them when he sees fit. He still judges idolatry, injustice, hardness of heart, and he remains the only one able to call back to life what has already been filed away as a lost cause. Ezekiel's vision does not promise an easy road, quick fixes, or a life without scars. It does not guarantee a return to comfort or the absence of marks from what was broken. It shows something more essential. The God who withdrew from the temple because of unfaithfulness is the same God who came down into the valley to undo the ruin and reclaim a people lost in their own confusion. Has this story helped you in any way? Tell us in the comments. Your story is also part of the message we want to share, and if this content was meaningful to you, leave a like. That simple gesture lets us know we're on the right track and helps YouTube understand that videos like this matter, so it can recommend more of them. And you don't have to stop here. In the description and on the end screen, you'll find another episode just as striking, one you really shouldn't miss. The army that rose up on that day still stands in the memory of Scripture, and if he was able to make very dry bones stand as a restored people, then quietly, without spectacle, he may be looking even now at valleys that are less visible, deeper, more personal, waiting only for that one honest response: Sovereign Lord, you alone know.